In an instant that sent tremors through every marble hallway of Buckingham Palace, King Charles delivered an order so severe that even his most loyal aides froze where they stood. With only 7 chilling words, he severed years of royal tradition and tore apart the fragile illusion of unity inside the House of Windsor. The decree was simple yet devastating: remove Camilla's portrait immediately. Before we unravel the deeper storm this decision has unleashed across the monarchy, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next, because the truth only gets darker from here. It started with a quiet exchange behind doors sealed tight. Moments later, the directive swept through curators, protocol chiefs, and royal staff. No one dared challenge the king, but the weight of his command pressed heavily on every guard, servant, and advisor who received it. This wasn't an ordinary painting. It wasn't a forgotten piece hidden in some dim corner. It was the official state portrait of Queen Camilla, displayed boldly in one of the monarchy's most sacred halls, unveiled at the height of her ascension to queen consort. For many, it symbolized her acceptance, her carved place in royal legacy. And now, shockingly, it was being wiped away without mercy. Insiders say Charles's demeanor that morning was colder than winter stone. Silent yet razor-sharp. His words cut through the air with emotionless certainty. No raised voice, no dramatic fury, only pure calculation. That was the part that frightened the staff most, the unsettling quiet that hinted at something deeper. He offered Camilla no warning, no conversation, no reason. While she carried out duties in another wing, the removal began. Employees moved carefully, avoiding each other's eyes, swallowed by dread, confusion, and a rising sense of irreversible change. As one courtier whispered later, it felt like we were acting under a shadow that none of us fully understood. It felt like witnessing an execution, silent, swift, and utterly irreversible. By the moment Camilla learned what was unfolding, the gilded frame had already vanished from the wall. One of her aides delivered the news, his voice shaking as he described how the footmen, acting under the king's direct and unmistakable command, moved with ruthless precision. For Camilla, this wasn't merely a portrait being taken down. It was her standing in the monarchy being rewritten without permission, without warning, without even the courtesy of her presence. For senior palace aides, the situation became unbearable. Many had served both Charles and Camilla for decades, watching their long ascent from scandal to legitimacy, from whispers to crowns. And now those same advisors were ordered to dismantle the very symbol of everything Camilla had clawed her way toward. Some hesitated, some cried, and many obeyed in stunned, heavy silence, unable to process the magnitude. Never in modern royal memory had a queen consort's image been deliberately removed by the reigning monarch while she still lived, still reigned, and still shared his crown. This was no formality. This was personal. It wasn't about decor or optics. It was Charles carving a line into stone, a quiet act of vengeance, or perhaps a panicked correction for a legacy he feared was slipping away. Waves of betrayal, regret, and retribution rolled through the palace halls like thunder behind velvet curtains. Camilla's silence in that moment spoke louder than any outburst. But what could push Charles to humiliate his wife in a way that could never be reversed? It wasn't just artwork. It was authority, arrival, legitimacy. And for those who still lived beneath Diana's unending shadow, it was provocation. From the instant Camilla's portrait was hung, whispers formed into quiet rebellion. Those whispers have now erupted violently. The portrait had been commissioned in secrecy during Charles's early reign. Discretion was never part of the plan. Every stroke radiated ambition. Draped in regal brilliance, Camilla's posture was more than composed, it was commanding. Chin lifted, gaze unwavering. A quiet challenge locked forever in paint. And when the portrait was finally revealed, everyone noticed exactly where it had been positioned, sparking emotions impossible to contain. The Queen Mother's portrait, beloved by the older generation and still respected by the younger, was quietly removed to make way for Camilla. No announcement, no explanation, just gone. The symbolism couldn't have been clearer to those watching closely. Camilla wasn't merely being honored. She was being positioned behind palace walls. The reaction was divided and tense. Princess and, ever the traditionalist, voiced concern in private that the gesture was premature. William, though more guarded, reportedly remarked to a close aide that the portrait didn't feel like family. Charles, however, stood firm. He called the image a reflection of the monarchy's modern evolution, a visual statement that the past had been forgiven, if not forgotten. But forgiveness, especially within royal ranks, is rarely universal. And while Camilla appeared unbothered on the surface, she knew exactly what was being said behind her back. The press dissected every inch of the painting, Camilla's half-smile, the angle of her shoulders, the gleam of a sapphire brooch once worn by Diana. Everything became fuel for speculation. Was she staking her claim over the past? Was this her quiet revenge? Public reaction was mixed, but among royal loyalists and Diana's enduring admirers, the message hit a raw nerve. Letters poured into the palace. Social media ignited. Comparisons to Diana became relentless, and once again, the specter of the other woman narrative loomed over Camilla's image. The royal family, already fragmented by years of scandal and silence, now had a new fault line framed, gilded, and hanging on the wall, for all to see. Inside the palace, the portrait became a lightning rod, not just for public controversy, but for internal tension. Some avoided even walking past it. Others stopped to stare, almost daring it to blink. Camilla, despite her outward calm, began limiting her appearances in that gallery. She knew, she felt it. The portrait hadn't unified the monarchy. It had exposed its deepest fractures. But Charles didn't flinch. He saw in that frame the culmination of a lifelong battle, a declaration that he had chosen, and that choice was now untouchable. Or so he thought. Yet no. One could have predicted that a forgotten letter buried deep in royal archives would become the fuse to this royal explosion. A sealed envelope handwritten marked to be opened only if Camilla is crowned. It was Diana's final card, and no one knew it even existed until now. The moment Charles read her words, everything shifted. It had been decades since the world lost Princess Diana. Yet her presence lingered like a shadow across every corner of the monarchy. The decisions made in her absence often echoed with the weight of what she might have said, done, or felt. But nothing, state correspondence and private diaries, the envelope stood out not for its appearance, but for its instruction, and hesitated, her eyes scanning the seal, the handwriting she recognized instantly. Her hands reportedly trembled as she walked it directly to the king without a word. What Charles saw when he broke the seal was not a mere letter. It was a reckoning written just weeks before Diana's fatal car crash. The message was personal, piercing, and prophetic. In it, she addressed Charles directly. There was no bitterness, no venom, only raw vulnerability wrapped in an urgent plea. She asked him not to forget the damage already done, and not to allow a woman who had caused so much division to become the face of a monarchy that was still trying to heal. Never place her above. Legacy, she wrote. The line echoed in his mind like a bell tolling over lost time. Diana didn't ask for revenge. She asked for memory, for dignity, for the image of a royal family her sons could still believe in. And most hauntingly, she admitted her fear that if Camilla were ever crowned, the memory of the real Queen of Hearts would be quietly erased. One portrait, one ceremony, one title at a time. Charles didn't speak for the rest of the day. He canceled his meetings, retreated to his private quarters, and sat in silence. Aides said he refused food, turned off all communication, and remained seated long into the night. When a footman checked in on him near dawn, Charles was found staring at Camilla's portrait, his eyes red but dry, as if the tears had already been shed long ago. What passed through his mind in those hours is anyone's guess, but something in him cracked. It wasn't anger. It was the slow, suffocating realization that he had failed to protect the one thing. Diana had begged him to preserve the sanctity of her legacy for William and Harry. And with that came guilt. Not the fleeting kind, but the kind that anchors itself in the bones and refuses to let go. The letter didn't demand a course of action, but it didn't need to. Its very existence had already realigned everything. Diana had reached out from beyond the grave, not to judge, but to remind him of who he used to be and who he promised to be for their children. That haunting reminder left him with a choice. Not between two women, but between two futures. One steeped in correction, the other in consequence. And while Diana's words reopened old wounds, it was Camilla's reaction to the letter that sealed her fate. She thought it was all behind her. The media frenzy, the criticism, the ghosts of the past. But when Camilla learned about Diana's letter and Charles's silence, something inside her snapped, and her rage echoed through the palace. The discovery wasn't told to her. Gently. She overheard a hushed conversation between two senior aides. Whispers not meant for her ears. A letter from Diana. A direct plea to Charles. And the worst part, he hadn't told her. That betrayal struck her harder than any headline or scandal ever had. She stormed into the red drawing room, face flushed, not with shame, but fury, demanding answers. When Princess Anne entered the room moments later, carrying the composed air she was known for, Camilla exploded. She accused Anne of orchestrating the entire thing, of playing puppet master to a brother already drowning in regret. Her voice shook the paintings that lined the ancient walls. And, ever composed, stood her ground. She informed Camilla that the letter was now a matter between the king and his conscience and no one else. That answer only ignited more fury. Camilla accused Anne of emotional blackmail, of manipulating Charles by weaponizing Diana's memory. She called it cruel, vindictive, and unnecessary. But Anne didn't flinch. She calmly replied, "Some memories deserve to be defended." That phrase shattered what little restraint Camilla had left. She stormed through the corridors like a tempest, slamming doors and lashing out at staff who dared to make eye contact. Later that evening, Charles walked into the private library and found her in a frenzy, ripping apart documents, hurling books, demanding every trace of Diana's influence be removed from the archives. He said nothing at first, just stood there, watching the woman who had fought her way into the monarchy begin to unravel in the very house she had once longed to control. What followed were days of chaos. Royal security logged multiple incidents of shouting matches behind closed doors. Staff reported hearing Camilla scream words like replaced, betrayed, and erased. Charles didn't yell back. His voice remained low, but the words he chose carried more finality than any raised tone could. He refused to hand over the letter. He refused to discuss it, and most damningly, he refused to reassure her that nothing would change. Camilla, desperate to reassert her authority, drew a final line in the sand. She looked Charles in the eye and delivered a chilling ultimatum. "I am your queen. That painting stays." But Charles was no longer a husband seeking peace. He was a king seeking redemption. When Princess Catherine entered the king's private study that morning, she wasn't just a daughter-in-law. She was the face of the monarchy's future. What they discussed behind those doors would change everything and mark the beginning of a royal rebalancing. It was an invitation that came without formal fanfare, deliberate, private, and laced with silent urgency. Charles had requested to speak with Catherine alone, a rarity given how closely guarded such meetings typically were. She arrived quietly, carrying the weight of generations on her shoulders, and what unfolded in that room would echo through the very structure of the crown. Charles opened the conversation not with orders, but with questions, deep ones, uncomfortable ones. He asked how she viewed the role of a queen in the eyes of the people today, not in titles, not in protocols, but in symbolism. Catherine, graceful under pressure, responded not with rehearsed lines, but with thoughtful reflection. She spoke of the monarchy as a living story, one whose strength came not from rewriting the past, but from honoring it. And in that story, she said, there were wounds yet to heal. Charles listened in silence as Catherine touched on the growing sentiment across the nation. How many still felt the absence of Diana not just as a figure of the past, but as a moral compass the public hadn't forgotten? She didn't attack Camilla, nor did she defend her. Instead, she spoke of legacy, dignity, and the enduring power of restraint. She referenced polling data that showed the monarchy's most trusted and beloved figure wasn't a reigning monarch but herself. Not out of vanity, but because the people saw something they recognized. Humility, calm strength, and an echo of Diana's grace. Charles, visibly moved, asked whether she believed Camilla's public image had helped or hindered the crown's stability. Catherine paused, choosing her words carefully, and then delivered the line that would stay with him. "Sometimes the loudest symbols are the ones we no longer need to see." That sentence struck Charles like a quiet thunderclap. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with truth. Catherine rose to leave, offering no demand, no suggestion, only a quiet nod that signaled understanding. As she stepped out, Charles remained seated, eyes fixed on the wall where Camilla's portrait hung, larger than life, almost daring him to make a choice. The silence stretched for minutes. His thoughts drifted between memory and responsibility, between loyalty and leadership. Something unspoken passed through him then, an internal reckoning that could no longer be delayed. The conversation hadn't been an argument. It had been a mirror, and in that mirror, he saw a monarch being quietly asked to rise above emotion and choose legacy over loyalty. By nightfall, a team was already on its way to carry out the quiet removal, but not without resistance. When a king speaks, the nation listens, but not everyone obeys. In a shocking act of defiance, senior staff close to Camilla refused to remove her portrait, risking their careers in a final stand against a monarch they believed was faltering under guilt. The order had been given, and the removal was set to happen quietly, without ceremony or spectacle. But silence was not something Camilla's inner circle was willing to accept. Within hours of Charles's private decree, Camilla's most trusted aide, the same private secretary who had managed her public image for years, made a discreet but deliberate leak to the press. Word spread quickly. King orders removal of Queen's portrait. It hit the front pages before the staff had even reached the gallery. For Charles, it was a calculated act of betrayal. For Camilla, it was a desperate attempt to seize control of a crumbling narrative. The leak turned what was meant to be a symbolic course correction into a full-blown constitutional controversy. The palace found itself in chaos. Lines were being drawn in places that had long operated in shadows. Staff who had served Camilla for decades challenged the king's order, calling it impulsive, emotional, and dangerously unprecedented. "This is not how a monarchy endures," one was heard saying behind closed doors. "This is how it fractures." Charles's chamberlain, appointed for his loyalty and discretion, stood firm, insisting the portrait be removed as instructed. What followed was a heated confrontation that rocked the inner sanctum of royal operations. Camilla's chief aide, accusing the king's office of erasing a reigning queen from public memory without due process. Tempers flared. Security was briefly summoned. The monarchy, known for its tradition of silence and composure, was now cracking under the weight of its own symbolism. Amid the rising tensions, it was Prince William who stepped in discreetly yet decisively. He did not take sides publicly, but his presence spoke volumes. Behind the scenes, he offered support to Charles, not as a son clinging to loyalty, but as a future king, safeguarding the monarchy's integrity. His intervention helped de-escalate what could have turned into a public palace war. But the damage was already done. The media picked up on the internal discord, spinning tales of a divided court, a queen abandoned, and a king haunted by the ghost of his past. Headlines screamed of dysfunction, betrayal, and a royal house teetering on the edge of implosion. Camilla, blindsided by the velocity of events and the erosion of her authority, retreated to Mill House, her private sanctuary. Far from the throne's cold corridors, she issued no statement. She took no calls. For 48 hours, she vanished from royal life, refusing even to speak to Charles. It was her silence now that sent a message, one of wounded pride and simmering resentment. Those who had fought for her were left directionless as the queen herself withdrew from the very battle they had ignited on her behalf. And just when the storm seemed to reach its peak, Charles made a second, even more devastating move. She had waited in silence. But now, decades later, Diana returned, not through whispers or scandals, but framed in royal gold and crowned by legacy. Her portrait was placed exactly where Camilla's had been, and this time the message was crystal clear. It happened. Without announcement, without a press release, and without the usual pageantry that accompanies palace decisions. Charles had given his private approval just days after Camilla's retreat to Ray Mill House. In the early morning hours, under heavy discretion, palace staff transported the iconic 1995 portrait of Diana, an image etched into the hearts of millions, to the Grand Gallery. The very wall that once bore Camilla's likeness was now home again to the woman the world never stopped mourning. No ceremony was scheduled. No speech was prepared. But when the gallery doors opened that evening to select guests and dignitaries, the silence said everything that needed to be said. Standing at either side of the portrait were two women whose presence spoke volumes. Princess Anne, firm and resolute, and Princess Catherine, serene and glowing with quiet strength. They didn't need to speak. Their stance beside Diana's image reflected more than solidarity. It reflected continuity. For many, it was a moment of poetic justice. For others, it was history correcting itself in real time. As guests filtered in and saw the portrait, emotions surged through the crowd. Some wept, some gasped, and others simply stood in reverent silence, overcome by the weight of what they were witnessing. Diana, the woman the crown had once failed, was now being reinserted into the very heart of it. Within minutes, images of the portrait flooded social media. Tributes from around the world poured in, blending admiration with cathartic relief. Memes, hashtags, and tributes all bore one truth. Diana was back, not in body, but in presence, in legacy, in power. People didn't just see a painting. They saw a promise restored. Comparisons to Camilla's removed portrait were inevitable, but the overwhelming tone was clear. Diana's place had always been there. This was not an act of nostalgia. It was an act of royal reckoning. Insiders whispered that Charles remained out of sight during the unveiling. He had watched from a distance, standing just beyond the archway, hidden from the crowd, but not from the meaning of the moment. Those closest to him claimed he whispered under his breath, "This is how she should have been remembered," before turning away and disappearing down the corridor. For William, the moment carried even more weight. Cameras did not capture it, but multiple attendees reported seeing him standing motionless in front of the portrait, tears silently falling down his cheek as he gripped the hand of his wife. It was not just about his mother's return. It was about reclaiming a truth that had been buried too long. But as the monarchy tried to restore balance, Camilla was preparing her own counter-move. And it was anything but quiet. She had been silent for too long. But now Camilla was ready to speak. And when she did, it wasn't the voice of directly to a single media outlet known for its historical allegiance to Camilla's side of the story. It began with poise, but ended in fire. Camilla accused the monarchy of indulging in selective memory, of choosing sentiment over loyalty, and of allowing history to be rewritten by public pressure and media nostalgia. Without naming Diana, she made it clear who the target was. She spoke of the quiet sacrifices she had made, how she'd stayed in the shadows for decades, reshaping herself to serve a monarchy that never truly accepted her. She hinted at the personal costs, the isolation, the silence, the invisible compromises she made for a king who now in her eyes had turned his back. The fallout was immediate. The public was split down the middle. Some sympathized, calling it a rare moment of honesty from a royal who had always played the long game. Others saw it as tone-deaf and inflammatory, especially following the emotional return of Diana's portrait. The phrase "rewriting royal truth" trended for hours as social media descended into a digital war of legacies. But perhaps the most telling moment came just days later when Camilla appeared in public, her hand bare. The wedding ring that had symbolized the pinnacle of her long and controversial journey was conspicuously absent. It wasn't acknowledged, but it didn't need to be. The message was loud, chilling, and deliberate. Her allies in the press, those who once painted her redemption arc in flattering prose, began to retreat. Opinion columns shifted tone. Supportive voices grew quiet. A narrative that once positioned Camilla as the survivor, the reformer, the woman who weathered the storm was unraveling. Now she was portrayed as bitter, reckless, and unwilling to let go of a crown that no longer wanted her. And from the palace, nothing. Not a single rebuttal. Not even a whisper. The silence in this case spoke volumes. It wasn't just indifference. It was eraser. Without the palace's voice, Camilla's words hung in the air, loud, defiant, and yet unanswered, like a scream in an empty room. She had gone from queen consort to something else entirely, a woman alone in the highest place of power, now watching it slip through her fingers. The monarchy had turned a page, and she was no longer part of the story it wished to tell. But what no one expected was how far Charles would go to ensure this chapter was closed for good. In a room lined with centuries of royal history, King Charles signed a single document, and with it removed the last symbol of Camilla's influence from the future of the monarchy. It was quiet. It was swift, and it was final. The decree bore no public fanfare, no press conference, and no speech. It was not read aloud, nor was it framed for display, but within the walls of the palace, it rang louder than any royal proclamation in recent memory. With one stroke of his pen, Charles stripped Camilla's portrait from all future state material.